For joining us from Leeds. Thank you. On Europe, Janan, what's the logic, other than a sense of panic, that the Prime Minister goes to Iceland and talks about the Norwegian option and doesn't mention the Icelandic option, maybe because 75 to 80% of Icelandic people rather like it?
The logic is that he can drive a wedge into the anti-EU movement by bringing to our attention that they can't agree on what out means. Does it mean complete exit? Does it mean the Norwegian model? Does it mean the slightly distinct Swiss model of semi-detachment? Does it mean a sort of mythical third or fourth option which Britain negotiates for itself? The Eurosceptics' biggest problem is they can't agree on what exit means, and the more that Cameron talks about it, even if it's quite specious in the way he goes about it, the more he brings attention to the fact that in means something quite clear, out for the time being.
Does it mean something quite clear? We don't know which way the Eurozone is going to go in the future. Both Mrs. Merkel and President Hollande have been talking about the need for much closer integration in the Eurozone. That has huge implications for those who are not in it.
No, it doesn't. We don't know what it means in 5 years' time. But if you voted yes to stay in, you'd know what the world would be like the following day. You literally wouldn't know what the world would be like the following day if you voted out. It may be perfectly fine, and we may be able to negotiate an acceptable model of exit or semi-detachment. But the burden, I think, is on the Eurosceptics to say what out would mean literally immediately. And I don't think you can sustain a referendum campaign without having a strong position on that.
Do you detect a sense of panic now in Downing Street about Europe, that they're kind of losing control of the argument and they don't want out, and they're suddenly frightened that, hey, we might end out against our will?
I think that's true. I think there was a certain complacency around on all sides of people who were in favour of staying in. That somehow, business, the CBI, common sense, but the polls are going the wrong way. The longer that he leaves it to the referendum, the worse the migration crisis is going to look, and that's at the heart of this. And if Nigel Farage, who was really rather convincing earlier today on television, if he can persuade people, in my opinion quite wrongly, that somehow the migration crisis will be solved if only we were out of Europe, he might be really onto a winner. And I think this has dawned on Downing Street, and it's pretty frightening because it's not going away anytime soon.
Well, the migration crisis is likely to get much worse in the months ahead as we hit winter. And a lot of these refugees or asylum seekers or economic migrants, whatever you call them, their families, a lot of them, they're going to be in terrible circumstances. That'll keep it on the screens. And the moment Mr. Cameron tells his party what it is he's actually looking for, that's another crisis for him because they won't be happy.
Yes, they won't be happy, and as Theresa May, she was putting a big question mark over the UK's involvement in freedom of movement, and the Prime Minister is not going to get that fundamental point changed. But what is going on here is that David Cameron came out of the election and he thought he could just sort of concentrate on his renegotiation. He would then achieve a success, see whether it's success, and then make the case. And what they've now realised is that actually the in campaign and the out campaign are on the pitch, and they, the government, are not. And on that pitch, the Leave people, because they're running a very effective insurgent campaign, are doing quite well and setting the agenda. And so what the government is trying to do is hit on the head what the fundamental weakness of the Leave campaign is, which is what Janan is talking about, is that they cannot say what future we have, because when you leave the European Union, you trigger Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty. At that point, you leave the European Council. You're still in the EU, leave the European Council. The European Council, which is the then 27 leaders, appoint 2 member states to negotiate with you your departure. That takes 2 years, and then that is voted on not by you, but by the other 27 on the basis of a qualified majority vote, which means that the UK couldn't count on friends like Germany being able to rally to our support. And what they're trying to say, the Prime Minister is trying to say, is you have absolutely no ability to say what sort of arrangement we're going to have. And that's where they're finally sort of coming onto the pitch.
And Mr. Osborne goes to Berlin to make a speech this week on, again, I assume further to outline what it is he wants, or the government wants from the European Union. But this is becoming a problem for the Chancellor as well, isn't it? His future career, and he goes at a time when it's not been the best past 10 days for him. In fact, we're told he didn't give enough attention to tax credits because he's so busy worrying about this speech and the renegotiation. He goes down with the ship as well if this all goes pear-shaped I think that's probably a mixed metaphor, but you get my point.
Yeah, and it's easy to imagine that the Conservative Party will demand in a few years' time a radically Eurosceptic leader, if not an explicitly pro-exit one, then someone who's degrees of separation away from where Cameron and Osborne are now. So there's a personal political problem there. But I find the visit to Berlin fascinating because as recently as 6 months ago, it made sense to put all your eggs in Angela Merkel's basket, regard her as the Empress of Europe and someone who would do a deal through sheer political clout for her friend David Cameron.
And she's now the walking wounded.
Well, will she run again? She might be toppled even before then. She's in much more trouble than anyone, I think, in this country entirely understands. And the trip to Berlin makes less sense now than it would have done,
And what he's going to get in Berlin is what he wants to get, the protections for those members who are not in the Eurozone to ensure that on the rules of the single market they cannot be ganged up on. And it looks like he might get something on there, an emergency brake, not a veto. And the thing is, that will appeal to people's heads. But where these negotiations are really going to matter is in people's hearts, which is what you're talking about, migration. And on that ban on EU migrants claiming in-work benefits for 4 years, it looks like the government is really, really struggling on that one.
They're backtracking on that. And we have to remember that Cameron started off saying, we're not going to go bagging on about Europe. And you know what they are. We're not going to have a referendum. Oh, yes, they are. And what's more, having a referendum at the lowest peak for any government.
Right
when
in
you're
mid-term.
You're 2 years in, they'll be hellishly unpopular in the middle of all of these cuts. There will be an anti-establishment move. And I think it's
government.
really scary, voting against government.
How's Mr. Corbyn doing?